I used to believe that starting over was simply a matter of moving your money across a border, but I learned the hard way that you can never outrun the person you are. My name is Hugo. I am 60 years old, and less than 3 years ago I left New York City with a massive fortune. Today I'm entirely broke, surviving day to day in the shadows of Mexico City. And I want to tell you the brutal truth about what happens when you try to buy an escape from your own life. For nearly 4 decades, I existed in the cold and unforgiving atmosphere of high finance, operating as an investment banker in a world where human value was measured exclusively by quarterly yields and aggressive corporate acquisitions. I spent my entire adult life accumulating wealth with a desperate and unyielding hunger, genuinely believing that if I simply built a wall of money high enough, it would keep the loneliness and the quiet terror of aging at bay. I sacrificed my youth, my peace of mind, and any chance at a meaningful personal life to that single-minded pursuit. By the time I reached my late 50s, I had amassed a net worth that most people can barely comprehend. A fortress of capital that was supposed to make me untouchable. But sitting alone in my glass-walled penthouse overlooking a city that never stops moving, I realized I was entirely hollow. I was a man who owned everything and felt absolutely nothing, surrounded by expensive furniture and priceless art that only served to echo the profound silence of my existence. The wealth had not purchased my freedom. It had become a heavy and suffocating blanket that isolated me from the rest of humanity. The realization that I was wasting my limited time on earth did not come to me like a sudden epiphany, but rather as a slow and agonizing creeping sensation that I was suffocating in my own success. I would look at the older men in my firm, men in their 70s who were still aggressively trading and hoarding capital with one foot in the grave, and I felt a deep, visceral terror that I was looking at my own unchangeable future. I decided I needed a radical severing from my past, a complete and total dismantling of the architecture of my existence before my heart simply stopped beating from the stress. I did not want a quiet retirement on a golf course in Florida, because that felt like a waiting room for death. I wanted a total rebirth. I wanted to be shocked back into feeling alive. I liquidated my complex financial assets, severed my professional ties with a ruthless efficiency, and packed my life into a remarkably small amount of luggage for a man who owned so much. I chose Mexico City as the stage for my salvation. I had visited once in my youth and remembered it as a place of staggering historical weight, a sprawling metropolis where the ancient and the modern collided in a beautiful, chaotic rhythm. I wanted the warmth of the culture, the vibrant intensity of the streets, and the centuries of history layered beneath the paving stones. I wanted to be swallowed by a place that felt deeply and undeniably alive, desperately hoping it would resuscitate the dead spaces inside my chest. I arrived in the city with millions in my accounts and the supreme blinding arrogance of the man who believes his financial success has made him immune to the fundamental laws of human failure. Because I had conquered the most ruthless financial markets on earth, I assumed that navigating a new country would be a trivial exercise in capital deployment. The first year was a magnificent and intoxicating delusion. I rented a sprawling, light-filled apartment in the affluent Polanco neighborhood, surrounded by high-end boutiques and guarded entryways that made the transition from New York feel seamless and secure. I spent my mornings walking beneath the heavy purple canopies of the jacaranda trees, and my evenings dining in exclusive courtyards filled with acoustic music and the scent of rain on warm concrete. I was operating in an expatriate bubble of extreme luxury, insulated entirely from the actual heartbeat and struggle of the city that surrounded me. I threw lavish dinner parties, hired personal drivers, and tossed money at every minor inconvenience, treating the local population less like neighbors and more like a vast network of service staff dedicated to maintaining my comfort. I felt a profound sense of superiority, looking down from my balcony at the teeming streets and congratulating myself for being brave enough to leave the rat race, completely oblivious to the fact that I had simply brought the rat race with me. I was not exploring a new culture. I was aggressively purchasing a stylized version of it to serve as the backdrop for my own ego. It was during this golden period of manufactured perfection that I met Maya and she became the catalyst for both my deepest joy and my ultimate destruction. She was an independent architect and historical preservationist, a woman of profound intellect, fierce independence, and quiet intensity who possessed a deep and soulful understanding of the city's complex, layered history. We met at an art exhibition in Kyoakian, and she did not look at me with the deferential awe that I was accustomed to receiving from people who knew my net worth. She challenged me. She questioned my shallow assumptions about her country, and she demanded a level of authenticity that I had not practiced in decades. I was utterly captivated by her. Maya represented everything I wanted to become part of, a genuine and authentic connection to a world I was currently merely renting. Through her, I stopped feeling like an isolated tourist and began to desperately want to feel like I belonged to the soil. We spent countless hours walking through the historic center, drinking mezcal on dimly lit terraces, and talking about art, legacy, and the tragic beauty of architectural decay. I wanted to build something real with her, something that was tangible and lasting, something that wasn't just abstract numbers moving across a digital screen. Maya had a brilliant, deeply researched vision for restoring a massive, crumbling 18th century estate on the southern edge of the city, intending to transform it into a sanctuary for local artists and a boutique cultural retreat. It was a massive and perilous undertaking, riddled with structural complexities, historical preservation laws, and bureaucratic hurdles that would have deterred any rational investor. But my New York arrogance blinded me entirely to the danger. I was a master of the universe, and I genuinely believed I could throw my millions at this romantic vision, secure her love, and bend the reality of a foreign country entirely to my will. I funded the initial purchase and the preliminary architectural surveys of the estate entirely in cash, viewing the staggering cost not as a financial risk but as the inevitable price of admission into Maya's world. The property was a magnificent, decaying beast, situated behind high volcanic stone walls in the historic center of San Angel, a labyrinth of collapsing rooftops, overgrown courtyards, and centuries of neglected history. To Maya, it was a sacred space requiring patient, meticulous resurrection. To me, it was simply another failing asset that could be bullied into profitability through the sheer, brute force of capital. I brought the exact same aggressive, unforgiving methodology to the restoration that I had used to dismantle rival firms in Manhattan. I did not realize that I was operating in an entirely different universe, a system governed by ancient rhythms, labyrinthine municipal codes, and unwritten cultural rules that I fundamentally refused to understand. When the Federal Historical Preservation Authorities halted our initial demolition due to unapproved alterations to the original 18th century facade, I did not listen to Maya's quiet, urgent advice to respect the process. Instead, I reacted with the indignant fury of a man who is used to having the world step out of his way. I bypassed her local connections and hired a team of high-priced, aggressive attorneys from a corporate firm in Polanco, men who promised me they could expedite the permits and steamroll the local regulators. I thought I was being decisive and protective. I was actually demonstrating in the most painful and public way possible that I possessed absolutely no respect for the very culture I claimed to love. The bleeding began slowly, a quiet hemorrhage of funds disguised as necessary, unavoidable complications. The structural integrity of the main house was far worse than the initial surveys had indicated. When the heavy summer rains came, a temporary roof collapsed, destroying weeks of painstaking artisan plasterwork and deeply compromising the western foundation. Contractors I had hired without Maya's blessing, chosen simply because they promised the fastest possible timeline rather than the highest quality of care, began demanding exorbitant emergency advances to fix the cascading series of disasters. Every single week presented a new, catastrophic failure that required an immediate, massive wire transfer to resolve. In New York, when a project began to bleed, I would ruthlessly cut my losses, fire the underperforming managers, and liquidate the asset. But in Mexico City, I was paralyzed by a toxic combination of romantic desperation and monumental pride. I could not abandon the estate, because abandoning the estate meant admitting to Maya that I was a failure, and worse, admitting to myself that my wealth was not the omnipotent shield I believed it to be. So I poured good money after bad, systematically liquidating municipal bonds and dipping into the core retirement accounts I had sworn never to touch. desperately trying to plug the holes in a rapidly sinking ship. The psychological toll of this financial drain was far more devastating than the loss of the capital itself. As the stress mounted and delays stretched for months into a grueling year, the beautiful, intoxicating dynamic I shared with Maya began to curdle into something resentful and heavy. She watched the project she loved mutate into a chaotic, terrifying financial sinkhole, and she watched the man she thought she knew devolve into a paranoid, exhausted tyrant. I stopped walking with her under the jacaranda trees. I stopped listening to the acoustic guitars in the courtyards. I spent my days locked in my home office, staring at rapidly depleting bank balances on my glowing screen, screaming at attorneys over the phone, and frantically trying to exert control over a situation that was fundamentally uncontrollable. I was supposed to be escaping the soul-crushing anxiety of Wall Street, but I had managed to painstakingly recreate the exact same prison of stress in a different time zone. Maya tried to intervene, begging me to halt the construction, to scale back the grand vision, to just breathe and accept that we could not force the building to stand if the foundation was broken. But I looked at her not with love, but with the cold, cornered panic of a man who is drowning. I accused her of lacking vision. I threw the amount of money I was spending in her face, weaponizing my generosity to shut down her entirely valid concerns. It was the cruelest, most desperate thing I could have done, and the moment the words left my mouth, I saw the profound, tragic realization wash over her face. She realized in that instant that I had not actually changed at all. I was still just a banker, trying to buy her affection, trying to purchase a soul, and reacting with pure destructive rage when the transaction failed to clear. When Maya finally left, there was no dramatic screaming match, no shattering of expensive glassware in my immaculate Polanco apartment. There was only the quiet, devastating sound of a woman carefully packing her bags, a woman who had realized that her presence was merely subsidizing my delusions. She walked out the heavy mahogany door, and the silence that rushed in to replace her was absolute and terrifying. For the first time since I had arrived in Mexico City, I was completely and utterly alone. Stripped of the beautiful, authentic human shield I had used to justify my presence in this country. Without Maya to act as the cultural translator and the soul of the project, the restoration of the historic estate in San Angel instantly lost whatever fragile momentum it still possessed. The contractors, sensing the fatal shift in the wind and deeply offended by my aggressive, disrespectful management style, simply stopped showing up to the site. I would drive down there in the stifling afternoon heat, standing entirely alone in the dusty, half-demolished courtyards, staring at the exposed brick and the scaffolding that now looked less like a rebirth and more like a skeletal monument to my own staggering hubris. I was a man who used to move billions of dollars across global markets with a single phone call, and yet I could not figure out how to make a single local bricklayer return my calls. It was in the echoing, lonely chambers of my apartment that the true, cold mathematics of my ruin finally broke through my wall of denial. I sat down at my imported desk, poured a glass of scotch I could no longer afford, and forced myself to actually look at the ledgers I had been aggressively avoiding for months. The numbers did not care about my ego, and they did not care about my past successes on Wall Street. The reality on the screen was a terrifying, sheer cliff face of financial collapse. The aggressive corporate attorneys I had hired to bully the Municipal Preservation Board had not only failed to secure the necessary permits, but they had also billed me into oblivion, draining hundreds of thousands of dollars in endless cyclical retainers. The emergency structural repairs, the imported materials that had rotted in the summer rains, and the sheer, brutal burn rate of maintaining my luxurious expatriate lifestyle had systematically annihilated my liquid assets. I watched the cursor blink next to a bank balance that was closer to zero than I had seen since I was 22 years old. The speed at which a fortune can vanish is one of the most deeply unsettling truths of the human experience. You spend 40 years meticulously building a fortress of wealth, convincing yourself it is made of stone, only to discover in the span of 18 months that it was made of dry paper, and you were the one holding the match. The descent from the apex of society to the absolute bottom does not happen all at once. It happens in a series of small, humiliating, unavoidable increments. It started with the subtle indignities that a man of my former stature finds entirely incomprehensible. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my premium credit card was casually declined at a high-end grocery store in Roma. I remember standing there under the fluorescent lights, feeling a hot flush of embarrassment, quickly offering a different card, only to have that one rejected as well. I laughed it off to the cashier as a banking error, a temporary security freeze due to international travel. But as I walked out onto the street empty-handed, a cold, freezing numbness started to spread outward from the center of my chest. The illusion of my infinite runway was gone. The landlords of my sprawling apartment, who had previously treated me with the utmost deference and respect, suddenly transformed into ruthless creditors the moment my rent payment bounced. The polite emails turned into formal legal notices taped to my door. I was trapped in a foreign legal system, entirely isolated, with no local advocates, no family to wire me emergency funds, and an overwhelming, paralyzing sense of shame that prevented me from reaching out to my former colleagues in New York. I had burned my bridges so spectacularly when I left the firm, mocking them for staying in the rat race, that the prospect of crawling back to them in total defeat was a psychological impossibility. I chose to drown in silence rather than admit I had been entirely wrong. The day the eviction became a physical reality rather than a legal threat was the day the last remaining pillars of my sanity completely collapsed. I watched, paralyzed by a cold and suffocating panic, as the building management in Polanco, men who had previously greeted me by name with a deferential nod, supervised the changing of the locks. I was allowed to leave with the exact same single suitcase I had originally brought from New York, a bitterly poetic symmetry that made me physically nauseous. Walking out of the polished marble lobby and onto the sunlit sidewalk of Avenida Presidente Masaryk, surrounded by the high-end boutiques and the wealthy patrons I used to count myself among, I experienced a profound and terrifying psychological dissociation. I felt entirely invisible, a ghost haunting the very streets I used to walk with such arrogant ownership. The city had not changed, but my relationship to it had been violently inverted. The massive, sprawling metropolis of Mexico City, which had previously felt like an endless playground of culinary delights and cultural exploration, suddenly transformed into a vast, indifferent concrete labyrinth where my survival was entirely irrelevant. The sheer scale of the city, which had once felt invigorating, now felt crushing and absolute. The first 72 hours of homelessness are a masterclass in the absolute fragility of the human ego. I spent the first night sitting on a cold stone bench in Park Lincoln, refusing to lie down, desperately clutching my suitcase and trying to project an aura of eccentric wealth rather than utter destitution. I was terrified of falling asleep, terrified of the shadows, and most of all, terrified of accepting my new reality. I kept expecting someone to tap me on the shoulder, a former colleague from Manhattan or an attorney, to tell me the cruel joke was over and my accounts had been magically restored. But the dawn broke. The park filled with nannies, pushing expensive strollers, and men in tailored suits, walking well-groomed dogs. And I was still just an unwashed, exhausted old man shivering in yesterday's clothes. The hunger hit me on the second day, a deep, hollow gnawing that I had never actually experienced in my entire 60 years of life. I had spent decades dining at Michelin-starred restaurants, analyzing wine pairings and complaining if a steak was slightly overcooked. Now, I found myself standing outside a humble street food stand in the Metro Auditorio, staring at the steam rising from the Como, realizing with a sickening clarity that I lacked the 50 pesos required to buy a basic meal. I had managed billions of dollars in corporate assets, but I had fundamentally forgotten how to survive without a platinum card in my pocket. As the days bled into weeks, I began a slow, agonizing migration away from the affluent enclaves of the city, pushed out by the heavy presence of private security and my own suffocating shame. I drifted eastward toward the historic center, blending into the dense, chaotic crowds near the Zocalo. The physical toll of the streets accelerated my aging process at a terrifying rate. A crisp, authoritative posture I had maintained for 40 years, buckled under the weight of exhaustion and poor nutrition. The expensive tailored clothing I had worn out of the apartment quickly became stained and frayed, stripping me of the visual armor that had always commanded respect. I became part of the background noise of the city, one of the countless invisible souls that the wealthy expatriates and the tourist actively looked past without a second thought. It was a brutal, systematic dismantling of everything I believed made me a man. In New York, my identity was entirely tethered to my net worth, my title, and my ability to intimidate others. In the unforgiving reality of the streets, none of that mattered. The market did not care about my past yields. The cold nights did not care about my Ivy League education. I was stripped down to the absolute biological core of my existence, forced to navigate the world not as a master of the universe, but as a vulnerable, aging mammal desperately seeking shelter from the rain. The most shattering irony of my descent was the sudden, undeniable clarity it brought regarding the people I had surrounded myself with. When I was a multimillionaire living in Polanco, I was constantly surrounded by expatriates and high society locals who praised my vision, drank my expensive imported liquor, and validated my every arrogant assumption. But the moment the money evaporated, that entire social ecosystem vanished into thin air. I was a pariah, a walking cautionary tale of financial ruin that they fundamentally could not afford to acknowledge, a mirror reflecting their own deepest fears. Yet in the deepest trenches of my poverty, sleeping in the sheltered doorways of centuries-old churches in the historic center, I experienced a quiet, enduring grace from the very people I had previously ignored. It was the working-class citizens of Mexico City, the street sweepers, the tamale vendors, the elderly women walking to early morning mass who noticed the broken American man huddled in the cold. They did not ask for my resume or question my poor investments. They simply offered me a piece of sweet bread, a hot cup of atole, or a worn blanket without uttering a single word of judgment. It was a profound, ego-destroying revelation. I had spent my entire life building fortresses to protect myself from the world, convinced that other people were a liability to be managed. But when the walls finally fell and I was left entirely exposed, it was the uncelebrated, quiet humanity of complete strangers that kept me alive. I had spent millions of dollars trying to purchase a soul in the city, completely blind to the fact that the actual soul of Mexico was found in the quiet, unspoken solidarity of the people I had spent my wealth trying to rise above. Now, I spend my days sitting in the quiet corners of the Alameda Central watching the endless, beautiful rhythm of the city move past me. I am 60 years old. I have exactly 2 changes of clothes to my name, and I rely entirely on the charity of the local parish and the occasional kindness of the working people I once treated as invisible. I watch the new arrivals, the wealthy expatriates sitting in the cafes of Condesa and Roma with their laptops and their expensive coffee, talking loudly in English about the incredible freedom and the cheap cost of living they have found down here. I look at them and I know exactly what they are running from, because I ran from the exact same thing. I thought I could buy a new soul by simply changing my coordinates and exchanging my currency. I thought that if I stripped away the high-pressure career and surrounded myself with historic architecture and vibrant culture, the fundamental emptiness inside my chest would miraculously heal. But the brutal, unavoidable truth of this world is that you always bring your own weather with you. The arrogance, the fear, and the desperate, suffocating need for control that made me successful in New York were the exact same traits that destroyed me in Mexico. I lost a massive, untouchable fortune because I was trying to aggressively purchase a peace that can only be cultivated from within. And yet, sitting here on this worn wrought iron bench, feeling the late afternoon sun warm my face as the cathedral bells ring out across the historic center, I realize a strange and deeply unsettling paradox. I am entirely destitute. My pride has been ground into fine dust, and I have lost absolutely everything I spent a lifetime acquiring. But in this total and absolute ruin, the deafening noise of my life has finally stopped. There are no portfolios to manage, no sprawling estate to protect, no carefully curated image to ruthlessly maintain. I am just an old man breathing the air, existing from one hour to the next, finally a part of the city instead of just a man trying to own a piece of it. The suffocating weight of my wealth is gone, and the terrible paranoia of losing it has been replaced by the quiet, humbling reality of simply surviving. I would not wish this brutal dismantling on anyone, but I ask you to look closely at the life you are building right now, or the life you are trying so desperately to escape. Ask yourself if the towering walls you're constructing around your existence are actually meant to keep the dangerous world out, or if you are simply locking yourself in. You can cross borders, you can liquidate your past, and you can spend every single dime you have trying to reinvent your reflection in a new language. But eventually the money runs out, the expensive distractions fade away, and you are left sitting in the silence, face to face with the one person you can never truly leave behind.